The cruelest betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people sitting at your Christmas table. Margaret Whitmore had spent 32 years making Christmas feel magical inside the two-story brick house on Willow Creek Drive in Columbus, Ohio. Every December, the same traditions filled the home her late husband built for their family. Cinnamon candles glowing on every windowsill, Bing Crosby softly playing from the kitchen radio, stockings hanging neatly above the fireplace, and the smell of roasted turkey drifting through every hallway. At 68 years old, Margaret still woke before sunrise to bake homemade dinner rolls from scratch because her son Daniel used to love them as a boy. Even now, after all these years, she still shaped each roll by hand while snow quietly covered the neighborhood outside. That Christmas Eve, the house looked perfect. The dining table sparkled beneath soft golden lights. Crystal glasses reflected the tree in tiny flickers. Wrapped gifts crowded the living room. Margaret stood in front of the oven adjusting her red sweater when Rachel walked into the kitchen carrying a tray of cookies with a smile so sweet it almost felt rehearsed. "Mom, sit down for once," Rachel laughed gently. "You work too hard." Margaret paused. Rachel rarely called her mom. Usually it was Margaret. Formal, distant. But lately, especially over the past few weeks, Rachel had become strangely attentive. Too attentive. She complimented the curtains, asked questions about the mortgage, offered to organize old paperwork upstairs. Even Daniel had changed. He kept mentioning retirement communities in casual conversation, as if planting harmless little seeds. "You know, Mom," he had said earlier while pouring wine, "there are some beautiful senior condos in Florida. Low maintenance. No stairs." Margaret forced a smile at the time, but something cold had settled quietly into her chest. She noticed the way Rachel glanced at Daniel whenever money came up, the way they lowered their voices when she entered a room, the way Daniel avoided eye contact whenever she mentioned the house. Still, she tried to ignore it. It was Christmas. Families were supposed to feel warm at Christmas. By 7 o'clock, relatives filled the house with noise and laughter. Margaret watched everyone from the kitchen doorway while carrying a tray of mashed potatoes. Her grandson Tyler raced through the hallway wearing reindeer pajamas while Rachel snapped photos for social media beside the tree. To anyone looking in from outside, they looked like the perfect American family. But Margaret noticed the performance underneath it all. Rachel touched Daniel's arm every time Margaret spoke, cutting her off with cheerful little jokes. Daniel barely asked his mother a single question all evening. At one point, Rachel stood beside Margaret and whispered with a smile, "Next Christmas might look very different around here." The words lingered longer than they should have. Later that night, after dinner plates were stacked and relatives began leaving through the front door, Margaret carried empty coffee cups toward the kitchen. She stopped halfway down the hallway when she heard Rachel's voice from inside the pantry near the laundry room. The tone was different now. Sharp, cold, real. Margaret froze beside the wall without meaning to listen. Then Daniel laughed quietly, and Rachel said the sentence that made Margaret feel the entire floor disappear beneath her feet. "After Christmas," Rachel whispered, "she's gone." Margaret could still hear Rachel's voice echoing in her mind long after the kitchen had gone quiet. "After Christmas, she is gone." The words followed her upstairs like a shadow. She closed the bedroom door softly behind her and sat on the edge of her bed without turning on the lamp. Downstairs, faint laughter still drifted through the house, while dishes clinked in the sink. Her family was still celebrating Christmas, while something inside her had quietly broken apart. For several minutes, Margaret simply stared at the framed photograph sitting on her nightstand. It showed her late husband Robert standing beside the very maple tree they planted in the backyard the summer Daniel turned 10 years old. Robert had built this home with his own hands. He spent weekends laying hardwood floors one plank at a time. He painted every room himself. Because they could not afford contractors back then, Margaret suddenly realized something painful. Rachel did not just want her out of the house. She wanted to erase her from it completely. Around midnight, the house finally became quiet. Snow pressed softly against the windows while wind rattled the gutters outside. Margaret should have been asleep, but her chest felt too tight to rest. She stepped into the hallway to get a glass of water when she noticed light glowing beneath the crack of Daniel's office door downstairs. Voices drifted upward through the silence. Margaret froze halfway down the staircase. Rachel laughed softly first. "I am telling you, once she signs everything over, We can finally breathe again. Daniel sounded nervous. Just keep your voice down. Oh, please, Rachel whispered. She practically sleeps with the television on full volume. She will never hear us. Margaret slowly lowered herself onto the third stair, barely breathing. I already talked to Melissa about the nursery, Rachel continued. The upstairs bedroom gets the best morning light. It is perfect for the baby. Margaret felt her stomach twist. The upstairs bedroom Rachel mentioned was hers. The room Margaret had shared with Robert for nearly 40 years. Daniel hesitated. Maybe we should wait a little before pushing her. Rachel let out a frustrated sigh. Daniel, your mother is sitting on almost $700,000 in this market. Do you understand what that house is worth now? We are drowning in debt while she rattles around in that place alone. Margaret pressed her hand against the stair railing to steady herself. Besides, Rachel added coldly, she cannot keep living there forever. The stairs are already hard for her. We will make it sound like we are helping. Daniel was quiet for a moment before speaking again. The retirement place in Dayton looked nice. Rachel laughed under her breath. Exactly. Small apartment. Community bingo. Bus trips to the grocery store. She will survive. Margaret felt heat rise behind her eyes, but no tears came. What hurt most was not Rachel's voice. It was Daniel's silence. Her son was not defending her. He was listening, agreeing, letting it happen. Did you find out where she keeps the house paperwork? Rachel asked. Daniel answered quietly. Probably upstairs in the filing cabinet. Good, Rachel said. After New Year's, we need to start organizing things before she changes her mind. Margaret stood frozen in the darkness while every memory she loved about this home suddenly felt contaminated. Christmas ornaments she saved for decades. Birthday dinners around the oak table. The growth marks penciled onto the laundry room wall when Daniel was a child. Rachel was already measuring the house like Margaret was gone. Suddenly a floorboard creaked beneath Margaret's foot. Silence filled the office instantly. Margaret moved quickly back upstairs before anyone opened the door. Once inside her bedroom, she locked the door for the first time in her life. Her hands trembled as she sat beside the window overlooking the snow-covered backyard. The old swing Robert built still stood near the fence beneath a blanket of white snow. Margaret stared out into the darkness until dawn slowly crept across the neighborhood. Somewhere between midnight and sunrise, the hurt inside her changed into something colder, clearer. By morning, Margaret Whitmore made a decision. She would not cry, she would not beg, and she would never let them see her afraid. The morning after Christmas arrived gray and bitterly cold across Columbus. Thin sheets of ice clung to the sidewalks outside Willow Creek Drive, while Margaret stood alone in the kitchen stirring cream into her coffee. She had not slept more than 2 hours, but when Daniel and Rachel came downstairs, she greeted them with the same gentle smile she had worn for years. Good morning, she said softly. Rachel walked in wearing silk pajamas and immediately kissed Margaret on the cheek. Mom, you should not be up cooking after hosting all day yesterday. Margaret nearly admired how convincing Rachel sounded. Daniel sat at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone while Margaret placed scrambled eggs and toast in front of him. He barely looked up. For the first time in her life, Margaret saw her son as a stranger sitting in her kitchen. And somehow that hurt more than anything Rachel had said. But Margaret also understood something important now. They believed she was weak. They believed she was emotional, predictable, old. That meant they would never notice her becoming careful. Over the next several days, Margaret quietly began changing the rhythm of her life inside the house. She moved slower on purpose, pretended to forget small things. Once, she asked Daniel where she had left her reading glasses while they sat directly on the counter in front of her. Rachel exchanged a glance with him that Margaret caught from the corner of her eye. Another afternoon, Margaret deliberately struggled carrying laundry upstairs. Rachel rushed over with fake concern. You really should not be doing stairs this often anymore, she said sweetly. You could fall. Margaret nodded softly, as if embarrassed. You are probably right, dear. Rachel smiled like someone slowly winning a game. By New Year's week, the mask inside the house began slipping further. Rachel stopped pretending as carefully whenever Margaret left the room. Daniel mentioned finances almost daily now. The housing market is incredible right now, Mom, he said one evening while helping himself to leftover meatloaf. Honestly, you could make a fortune selling this place. Margaret gave a tired little shrug. Maybe someday. Rachel looked almost disappointed by the answer. Margaret noticed everything now. The whispers. The sudden silence when she entered rooms. The way Rachel had started browsing furniture websites at the dining table. One afternoon, Margaret walked into the living room unexpectedly and saw Rachel holding her old property folder from the filing cabinet upstairs. Rachel jumped slightly. "Oh," she laughed nervously. "I was just helping organize some papers for you." Margaret smiled calmly. "That is thoughtful." Rachel handed the folder back a little too quickly. That same night, Margaret waited until everyone went to bed before quietly stepping into the garage with her winter coat and purse. She sat inside her car with the engine running just long enough to warm her hands before dialing a number she had not called in nearly 6 years. Harold Benton. Speaking. Margaret closed her eyes at the familiar voice. Harold had been Robert's attorney and closest friend for decades. "Harold," she said quietly, "I think I need help." There was a pause before his voice softened immediately. "Margaret? What happened?" For nearly 40 minutes, Margaret explained everything while snow drifted across the windshield outside. She told him about the conversation she overheard, about the pressure, about Rachel searching through paperwork upstairs. Harold listened without interrupting. When she finally finished, silence settled over the line for several seconds. Then Harold asked one simple question. "Margaret, whose name is actually on the deed?" Margaret frowned slightly. "Mine, I believe. Robert transferred everything after his surgery years ago." "Good," Harold said immediately. "Then nobody can force you anywhere." Something inside Margaret steadied for the first time since Christmas Eve. Harold continued carefully. "Listen to me closely. Do not confront them yet. Do not sign anything. And whatever you do, act normal." Margaret looked toward the glowing windows of the house where her son and daughter-in-law slept peacefully beneath her roof. "I can do that," she whispered. Before hanging up, Harold added one final sentence that stayed with her long after the call ended. "Margaret, people become very dangerous when they start counting money that does not belong to them." Margaret sat alone in the dark garage for several minutes after the call ended. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she smiled for the first time since Christmas. By the second week of January, the Whitmore house no longer felt like a family home to Margaret. It felt like a waiting room where everyone else believed they already owned the future. Snow continued falling across Columbus almost every afternoon, coating the neighborhood in thick white silence. But inside the house, Rachel moved through each room with growing confidence. Margaret noticed it in small things at first. Rachel started referring to the upstairs hallway as the nursery side. She talked openly about repainting walls. One afternoon, she stood in the kitchen flipping through expensive countertop samples while sipping coffee from one of Margaret's Christmas mugs. "White marble would brighten this entire room," Rachel said casually. "It feels outdated right now." Margaret folded dish towels quietly beside the sink. "Your father-in-law installed these counters himself," she replied gently. Rachel barely looked up. "Well, trends change." Margaret simply nodded. Every day, Rachel became bolder. It was as if she could already see Margaret disappearing from the house. Daniel was not much better. He avoided difficult conversations completely, pretending everything remained normal while slowly pushing Margaret toward the future he and Rachel wanted. One evening, he sat beside her in the living room while the evening news played softly in the background. "Mom," he began carefully, "have you thought any more about downsizing?" Margaret kept knitting without looking at him. "Not really." Daniel sighed. "You know, Rachel, and I only want what is best for you." Margaret almost smiled at the irony. "Best for you." Those words always appeared when someone wanted something. "That house is a lot to manage alone," Daniel continued. "A smaller place might actually make life easier." Margaret set the knitting needles down slowly and looked at her son for several seconds. There was a time Daniel used to cry when he scraped his knee riding bicycles in the driveway. A time he used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms because he was scared. Now he sat in Robert's recliner rehearsing ways to remove her from the home she built. "Maybe," Margaret answered softly. Daniel relaxed immediately, mistaking her calmness for surrender. Later that same week, Margaret met Harold Benton at a quiet diner 20 minutes outside the city near Grove City. The place smelled like burnt coffee and fresh pancakes, and nobody there recognized her. Harold arrived carrying a thick leather folder beneath his arm. "I checked everything personally," he told her once they settled into a corner booth. "The house is entirely yours. Daniel has no ownership claim whatsoever." Margaret stared down at the steaming cup in front of her. even though she already suspected it. Hearing the words spoken aloud changed something inside her. Harold opened the folder carefully. Robert protected you more than you realized before he passed. Margaret swallowed hard at the mention of her husband. Harold continued, lowering his voice. There is more. Your retirement accounts, investment portfolio, and life insurance beneficiaries have never been updated since Robert died. Daniel is still attached to nearly everything. Margaret looked up slowly. Can that be changed? Harold gave her a small, knowing smile. Immediately. For the next hour, Margaret signed document after document with steady hands while snow drifted against the diner windows outside. Harold helped her create a new trust, new beneficiaries, new financial protections. Every signature felt strangely peaceful. Not vindictive, not cruel, just necessary. Before leaving, Harold slid one final paper across the table. There is another option you should consider. Margaret adjusted her glasses. What is it? Sell the house quietly before they realize what is happening. Margaret stared at him in shock. Harold leaned back calmly. The market is still strong after the holidays. You could walk away with enough money to live comfortably anywhere you want. And legally, you owe nobody advance notice. For several seconds, Margaret said nothing. Then slowly, she imagined it. Rachel standing in the kitchen discussing renovations for a home she no longer owned. Daniel assuming the future belonged to him, while the entire foundation quietly disappeared beneath his feet. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt something stronger than sadness. Control. When she finally stood to leave the diner, Harold asked softly, "Do you know where you would go?" Margaret looked out at the falling snow and thought about all the years she spent living for everyone except herself. Then she smiled faintly. "Not yet," she answered, "but I think I would like somewhere warmer." The sale closed quietly on a Thursday morning in late January, while freezing rain coated the streets of Columbus in dull silver ice. Margaret sat inside Harold Benton's office wearing a dark blue wool coat and holding a styrofoam cup of coffee between both hands as the final documents slid across the conference table toward her. Outside the tall windows, traffic crawled through slush-covered intersections, but inside the office everything felt strangely calm. Harold adjusted his glasses and pointed toward the final signature line. "Once this is signed, the transfer becomes official tomorrow at 9 o'clock sharp." Margaret looked down at the paperwork for several seconds. The number printed near the bottom of the page barely felt real. Decades of memories reduced to legal paragraphs and wire transfers. Harold studied her expression carefully. "You still have time to reconsider." Margaret slowly shook her head. "No," she answered softly. "I already lost the home the moment they stopped treating me like family." Harold nodded once and slid the pen toward her. Margaret signed every page carefully in smooth blue ink. With each signature, she felt another piece of fear leaving her body. By the time the final document was complete, the Whitmore house no longer belonged to Daniel's future. It belonged to a young couple relocating from Chicago with 2 small daughters and a golden retriever named Baxter. Margaret had met them briefly during a private showing arranged weeks earlier while Daniel and Rachel attended a friend's engagement dinner. The couple had walked through the house holding hands and admiring the original woodwork Robert built himself decades ago. The wife nearly cried when she saw the bay window in the dining room. "This feels like the kind of house people stay in forever," she whispered. Margaret smiled politely at the time, though the irony almost hurt. Before leaving Harold's office, Margaret gave one final instruction. "Do not notify anyone until tomorrow morning." Harold smiled faintly. "I already made arrangements with the realtor and buyers." The moving company arrives at 9:30. Margaret stood and slipped on her gloves slowly. "Thank you, Harold." "No," he answered quietly. "Robert would have thanked me for protecting you." When Margaret returned home that evening, Rachel was sitting at the kitchen island surrounded by paint samples and catalog pages. Daniel stood beside her eating takeout Chinese food directly from a carton while they discussed kitchen renovations. Rachel looked up brightly when Margaret entered. "We were just talking about opening up this entire wall eventually," she said casually while pointing toward the dining room. "It would make the whole downstairs feel modern." Margaret removed her gloves carefully and hung her coat near the door. "I see." Daniel laughed lightly. Rachel watches too many renovation shows. But Margaret noticed neither of them sounded embarrassed anymore. They sounded comfortable. Certain. Rachel even asked casually, "Do you think you will finally meet with that retirement consultant next month?" Margaret looked at her calmly. Maybe sooner than you think. Rachel smiled with satisfaction, completely misunderstanding the answer. That night, Margaret walked through the house alone after everyone went upstairs. She touched the hallway wallpaper Robert picked out in 1993. She stood beside the fireplace where Daniel used to open presents every Christmas morning in footed pajamas. She paused outside the laundry room where pencil marks still tracked Daniel's height from first grade through high school graduation. For a moment, grief hit her harder than anger ever had. She was not just leaving a house behind. She was leaving the illusion that sacrifice guaranteed love. Near midnight, Margaret carried one small suitcase down the stairs and placed it quietly beside the front door. She had already arranged for the rest of her belongings to be shipped directly to South Carolina next week. Almost everything else she left behind no longer mattered. Upstairs, she heard Rachel laughing softly in the bedroom while Daniel showered. They sounded relaxed, victorious. Margaret wondered if either of them had noticed how peaceful she had become over the past few days. Probably not. People blinded by greed rarely noticed silence until it was too late. Before going to bed, Margaret stood one final time at the kitchen window overlooking the snow-covered backyard. Tomorrow morning, strangers would legally own every inch of the property Rachel had already mentally redecorated. Margaret wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself and smiled faintly into the dark glass reflection staring back at her. For the first time in years, she no longer felt trapped inside her own life. The next morning began with the sound of heavy tires crunching across frozen snow outside the Whitmore house. Margaret had already been awake for nearly an hour, dressed neatly in cream-colored slacks and a soft cashmere sweater while quietly sipping coffee at the kitchen table. Sunlight reflected off the icy driveway in pale silver streaks when the first moving truck slowly pulled to the curb. Rachel walked downstairs carrying her phone and stopped mid-step when she noticed the large white truck outside the front window. "What is that?" she asked sharply. Margaret looked up calmly from her coffee cup. "The movers." Rachel frowned in confusion. "What movers?" Before Margaret could answer, a second SUV pulled into the driveway behind the truck. A young blonde woman stepped out holding the hand of a little girl wearing a pink winter coat. Behind them came a tall man carrying a folder beneath his arm, while a golden retriever bounded excitedly through the snow. Rachel stared through the window, completely frozen. "Daniel!" she suddenly yelled toward the staircase. Footsteps thundered overhead seconds later before Daniel appeared wearing sweatpants and a wrinkled sweatshirt. "What is going on?" Rachel pointed frantically outside. "Who are these people?" Margaret slowly placed her coffee cup into the sink. "The new owners." Silence crashed into the kitchen so heavily it almost felt physical. Daniel blinked several times as if he had misheard her completely. "What?" Margaret folded her hands calmly in front of her. "I sold the house." Rachel let out a short, nervous laugh. "That is not funny. It was finalized yesterday morning." Margaret continued quietly. "Ownership transferred at 9 o'clock today." Daniel stared at her in disbelief. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Margaret reached into the kitchen drawer and handed him a thin envelope. Inside were copies of the finalized sale documents Harold had prepared. Rachel snatched the papers first and began flipping through them wildly. Her face drained of color line by line. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Outside, movers were already unloading furniture dollies from the truck. The young couple stood smiling near the sidewalk while speaking with the realtor. The little girl pointed excitedly toward the upstairs windows. Rachel looked ready to collapse. "You sold the house without telling us." Margaret's voice remained perfectly steady. "It was my house." Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. "Mom, this does not make any sense." Margaret looked directly at him for the first time all morning. "Actually, it makes perfect sense." Rachel suddenly slammed the paperwork onto the counter. "You cannot just throw family out into the street." Margaret almost smiled at the irony of hearing those words from her. "Interesting," she replied softly, "because I seem to remember hearing something very similar right after Christmas." Rachel's expression changed instantly. Panic flickered across her face. Daniel looked between them in confusion. "What is she talking about?" Margaret stepped closer slowly. "I heard the conversation in the office that night. Every word." Rachel went completely silent. Margaret continued calmly. "I heard you discussing retirement homes. Selling my house. Turning my bedroom into a nursery." Daniel's face lost all color. Mom. I also heard the part where Rachel called me a burden. Rachel crossed her arms defensively. You were spying on us. Margaret shook her head once. No, Rachel. I was living in my own home. Outside, one of the movers knocked politely on the front door holding a clipboard. Margaret opened it before either Daniel or Rachel could move. Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore, the man said warmly. We are ready whenever you are. Margaret nodded politely. Thank you. I will only be taking the suitcase by the door. Daniel stared at her in shock. You are leaving? Yes. Rachel's voice cracked slightly now. Where are we supposed to go? Margaret looked toward the snowy driveway where the new owners laughed with their little daughters beside the moving truck. That, she answered quietly, is something you should have thought about before planning my future for me. For several seconds nobody spoke. The only sound came from the movers outside rolling equipment across the icy pavement. Daniel finally stepped forward looking smaller than Margaret had ever seen him. Mom, I never wanted to hurt you. Margaret studied her son carefully. Once upon a time she probably would have believed him, but not anymore. The sad thing, she said softly, is that you already did. Then Margaret picked up her suitcase, buttoned her coat, and walked calmly out the front door while Rachel stood speechless inside the kitchen she had already redecorated in her imagination. 3 weeks later, warm ocean air replaced the bitter winter winds Margaret had left behind in Ohio. Palm trees swayed gently outside the balcony of her new condominium in Charleston, South Carolina, while waves rolled lazily against the distant shoreline beyond the marina. Every morning Margaret sat outside with coffee wrapped between both hands and listened to seagulls instead of arguments. For the first time in decades, the silence around her felt peaceful instead of lonely. The condo itself was smaller than the Whitmore house, but it felt lighter somehow. Cleaner. Nothing inside it carried the weight of disappointment. Margaret bought soft blue curtains for the bedroom and placed fresh tulips near the kitchen sink every Sunday morning. She spent afternoons walking along the waterfront in comfortable sneakers without anyone questioning where she was going or how long she would stay. Yet despite the peace surrounding her new life, Daniel continued calling almost every day. At first Margaret ignored every voicemail. Then the messages became longer. Sadder. Mom, please call me back. I just want to talk. I made mistakes. Rachel never called directly, but Margaret occasionally heard her voice faintly in the background during Daniel's messages, sharp and frustrated. Harold later informed Margaret that Rachel and Daniel had been forced to move into a small apartment outside Columbus after spending most of their savings expecting the house to become theirs. Apparently, Rachel blamed Daniel for letting this happen. Margaret felt no joy hearing that. Only distance. One rainy Thursday evening in February, Margaret received a message that surprised her. Daniel wanted to visit. For several hours, she stared at the phone in silence before finally agreeing to meet him at a seafood restaurant overlooking the Charleston harbor. When Daniel arrived the following afternoon, Margaret barely recognized him. He looked exhausted, older somehow. His shoulders slumped heavily beneath his jacket while dark circles framed his eyes. For a moment, Margaret saw flashes of the little boy who once ran barefoot through her backyard chasing fireflies during summer evenings. Daniel sat across from her quietly, while waiters carried plates of shrimp and crab cakes between nearby tables. You look good, Mom, he said softly. Margaret folded her napkin carefully onto her lap. South Carolina has been kind to me. Daniel nodded awkwardly. I deserve that. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped gently against the restaurant windows while boats rocked slowly in the marina outside. Finally, Daniel looked down at his hands. Rachel left last week. Margaret did not react. She said everything became my fault after the house was gone. He continued bitterly. I guess things stopped feeling exciting once there was no money attached to it. Margaret sipped her iced tea quietly. Daniel laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor in it. I kept telling myself we were just trying to help you. That downsizing made sense. Margaret looked directly at him. No, Daniel. You were trying to help yourselves. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. I know. The waiter arrived briefly with their meals before disappearing again into the crowded dining room. Daniel barely touched his food. I keep replaying Christmas in my head, he admitted quietly. I cannot believe I let things get that far. Margaret watched rainwater slide slowly down the restaurant windows. The painful part was never the house, she said softly. It was realizing my own son sat there, while someone planned my future like I was already gone. Daniel's face tightened with shame. I am sorry, Mom. Margaret believed he meant it. But some apologies arrive after the damage becomes permanent. They sat quietly for a long moment while ocean waves rolled beyond the harbor outside. Finally, Daniel looked at her carefully. Do you think you can ever forgive me? Margaret rested both hands around her coffee cup and stared toward the gray Atlantic horizon. Forgiveness is strange, she answered calmly. Sometimes you forgive people because carrying anger becomes too heavy. But forgiveness does not always mean you can trust them again. Daniel swallowed hard, but nodded slowly. Deep down, he already understood. When dinner ended, Margaret hugged her son briefly outside the restaurant beneath the soft February rain before watching him walk back toward the parking lot alone. She felt sadness watching him disappear into the distance, but not regret. Some lessons only arrive after people lose the very thing they thought would always remain waiting for them. And for the first time in her life, Margaret finally understood that protecting her peace did not make her selfish. It made her free. By spring, Margaret Whitmore no longer counted her life in sacrifices. She counted it in peaceful mornings, quiet evenings, and the simple freedom of waking up without fear sitting heavy on her chest. Charleston had transformed her in ways she never expected. The ocean air softened something inside her that years of disappointment had hardened. Every morning, she walked along the waterfront before sunrise wearing white sneakers and a light sweater, while fishing boats drifted slowly through the harbor. Some mornings, she stopped at a small bakery near East Bay Street, where the young cashier already knew her order by heart. Other mornings, she simply sat on a weathered bench facing the Atlantic and watched the sky turn shades of gold and pale pink above the water. It amazed Margaret how peaceful life could feel once she stopped trying to earn love from people determined to take advantage of it. Daniel still called occasionally over the next few months. Sometimes Margaret answered. Sometimes she did not. Their conversations remained polite but fragile, like two people carefully walking across cracked ice. Rachel disappeared from the picture completely after the divorce papers were filed in April. Harold later told Margaret that Rachel had moved to North Carolina with another man she met through work. Margaret listened quietly before changing the subject. She no longer carried enough bitterness to care. One warm Saturday afternoon in May, Margaret finally unpacked the last remaining box from Ohio. At the very bottom beneath old photo albums and Christmas ornaments, she found a faded handwritten note tucked inside one of Robert's old toolboxes. The paper had yellowed with age. Robert's handwriting leaned slightly to the right the way it always had. Margaret sat quietly beside the window reading the short message over and over while tears slowly filled her eyes. If anything ever happens to me, promise me one thing. Do not spend the rest of your life taking care of people who stop taking care of you. Margaret pressed the note gently against her chest while ocean breeze drifted through the open balcony doors. For years she believed loyalty meant enduring anything, remaining silent, sacrificing endlessly. But somewhere between losing her home and finding herself again beside the ocean, Margaret finally understood something Robert had known all along. Love without respect eventually becomes a prison. Later that evening, Margaret attended a small outdoor concert near the marina with several women she met through a local book club. They laughed together beneath glowing string lights while a jazz band played softly in the background and sailboats rocked gently against the docks nearby. At one point, one of the women asked Margaret if she missed Ohio. Margaret looked toward the dark water shimmering beneath the moonlight and thought carefully before answering. I miss who I used to think my family was, she admitted softly. But I do not miss feeling unwanted inside my own home. The woman beside her squeezed her hand gently in understanding. As summer arrived, Margaret slowly built a new routine filled with things she once postponed for everyone else. She took painting classes, joined weekend ferry tours, bought herself fresh flowers every Friday without needing a special occasion. And every now and then, usually during quiet evenings beside the ocean, she allowed herself to remember the woman she used to be before fear and obligation made her smaller. One humid evening in late June, Margaret stood barefoot on the balcony outside her condominium while thunder rolled softly far out across the Atlantic horizon. Warm wind lifted her silver hair gently as city lights flickered along the harbor below. Her phone buzzed once beside her on the table. Another message from Daniel. Margaret glanced at the screen but did not open it immediately. Instead, she looked out toward the endless dark water stretching beyond the coastline and smiled faintly to herself. Months earlier, her family believed Christmas would become the beginning of her ending. They thought age made her powerless, replaceable, easy to push aside once she became inconvenient. But standing there beneath the Carolina sky with salt air filling her lungs and peace finally settling inside her heart, Margaret realized something beautiful. They had not taken her life away from her. They had accidentally given it back.